The warm coffee in front of Kong Dae-oh didn't ripple, but the diner's air turned to lead as a single drop of saliva hit Cassie's blue apron. She stood frozen, looking down at a 7-year-old girl in a purple dress who had just dared her to move. "Know your place," the child hissed, her small voice cutting through the diner like a serrated blade. Across the table, a man with a tattooed neck and a white button-up shirt slowly lowered his cup, his eyes locking onto the child with a lethal, controlled resolve that made the air in the room feel thin. The midday sun beat relentlessly against the streaked windows of the diner, a relic of better times that smelled of burnt grease and industrial-grade floor cleaner. Outside, the city's humidity turned the asphalt into a shimmering heat trap, but inside, the ancient ventilation system hummed a tired, rhythmic tune that failed to mask the sudden, terrifying silence of the lunch crowd. Behind the counter, 12 pairs of eyes, seasoned regulars and weary commuters, stopped mid-chew. The clinking of silverware vanished, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of a moral line being crossed in a place that usually only saw the quiet struggle of the working class. The silence in the diner was so heavy it felt as if the air conditioning had suddenly sucked out all the oxygen. Cassie didn't flinch, even as the wet mark on her blue apron began to soak through to her gray shirt. Beside the girl, a woman in an expensive suit didn't offer a napkin or an apology. Instead, she let out a short, sharp titter of a laugh. "Well," the woman whispered, checking her watch, "I suppose that's what happens when the service is this slow. Come along, Mia. We're late for your lesson." They began to slide out of the red vinyl booth, treating the assault like a minor spill they weren't responsible for cleaning. Then, the sound of a ceramic cup meeting a saucer echoed through the room like a gavel. Kong Dae-oh didn't move fast. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of a predator who already knew the hunt was over. As he stood, the white fabric of his button-down shirt strained against shoulders that looked carved from granite. The warm light from the overhead lamps caught the dark ink crawling up the side of his throat, the jagged Korean characters of his neck tattoo that marked him as the Iron Tiger. The mother froze, her hand hovering over Mia's shoulder. She looked up, expecting to see a typical bystander, but her gaze snagged on Kong Dae's face. His expression was a mask of cold, surgical calculation, his eyes focused with a resolve that made the air feel thin. He stepped out into the aisle, his shadow stretching across the linoleum until it swallowed the girl in the purple dress. The 12 pairs of eyes at the counter, the seasoned regulars and weary commuters, watched in absolute silence, frozen mid-gesture. He reached the double-glass doors of the entrance just as the mother found her voice to protest. With one hand shoved into his pocket and the other resting flat against the doorframe, Kong Dae blocked the only way out. He stood like a monolith, his muscular frame filling the exit. He didn't look at the mother. He looked directly at Cassie, who maintained her dignified and somber posture, before turning his intense gaze back to the family. "The bill hasn't been settled," Kong Dae said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the silverware. "And in this house, we don't leave until the debt is paid in full." The mother's face, once a mask of high society boredom, fractured into a mix of indignation and growing dread. She pulled Mia closer, her diamond rings catching the diner's fluorescent glow as she pointed a manicured finger at Kong Dae. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? Step aside this instant. You're harassing a child." Kong Dae didn't flinch. He remained a wall of muscle and white cotton, his gaze shifting slowly from the mother to the young girl, who was now clutching her chest, her eyes wide with a realization that her weapon of status had finally met a shield it couldn't penetrate. "A child only speaks what she has been fed," Kong Dae said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "She told this woman to know her place. I want to know, what exactly is that place?" The mother opened her mouth to snap a retort, but the words died as the sun outside was suddenly eclipsed. Two matte black SUVs swerved onto the curb, tires screeching against the hot asphalt. The doors swung open in perfect unison. For men in tailored black suits, their expressions as unreadable as the stone walls of a fortress, stepped out. They didn't run. They walked with a rhythmic, heavy stride that announced the arrival of the Iron Tiger Syndicate. They entered the diner, the bell above the door chiming a frantic, tinny warning. They didn't look at the patrons or the grease-stained menus. They moved straight to Kong Dae, flanking him like shadows given human form. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his brow, handed Kangdae a thin, black tablet. "The family's assets, boss," the man murmured. Kangdae took the device, but didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on the mother, whose bravado was now visibly dissolving into a cold sweat. "You think your place is at the top, looking down," he said, stepping forward. The circle of men closed in, isolating the family in the center of the room. "But places can be changed. Debts can be reassigned. And today, your daughter's spit just cost you the world you think you own." Cassie watched from behind the counter, her braids still and her heart hammering. For the first time in 12 years, the invisible servant felt the ground shift in her favor. Kangdae tapped the screen of the black tablet, and the air in the diner grew even colder. He didn't look like a man committing a crime. He looked like a god performing a necessary audit. "You value your place because of your access," he said, his voice as smooth and sharp as a scalpel. "So, let's see how you fare without it." The mother's phone chimed in her hand, a bright, cheery notification that felt obscene in the heavy silence. She glanced down, her eyes widening as she saw a message from her private bank. "Account balance, $0. Account status, under investigation." Before she could gasp, her husband's phone, resting on the table next to a half-eaten omelet, began to vibrate uncontrollably. One alert followed another. Corporate credit lines revoked, offshore holdings frozen, and a sudden, massive sell-off of their primary stock holdings initiated from an untraceable terminal. The Iron Tiger's men stood like sentinels, their presence ensuring no one interfered with the digital execution. Kangdae watched the color drain from the mother's face as the reality set in. Her world was being deleted in real time. The digital siege was relentless. In less than 60 seconds, the family's social and financial place had been systematically dismantled. Their membership at the exclusive country club was canceled. Their daughter's enrollment at the prestigious private academy was flagged for immediate withdrawal due to non-payment. "You taught your daughter that people like Cassie are invisible," Kangdae said, his thumb hovering over a final command on the tablet. "Now, the world is going to treat you exactly the same way. No credit, no status, no name." Mia began to cry, the high-pitched sound of a child who finally realized that her parents' power, the shield she had used to hurt others, had vanished. The mother reached for her husband, but he was staring at his phone in a catatonic state, watching as their life's work evaporated into lines of code. Cassie stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the cool laminate, witnessing the total power shift. The predators had been stripped of their teeth, leaving them small and exposed in a diner that no longer felt like their playground. The digital silence that followed the bank alerts was heavier than the humid city air outside. Kangdae stood motionless, a monolithic figure of ivory and ink, while the family's world collapsed into the static of their smartphone screens. The mother looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, searching for a face that would offer her a tether to her old reality. She looked at the men at the counter, the 12 pairs of eyes, who had spent years as the invisible scenery of her life. "Are you just going to sit there?" she shrieked, her voice cracking as it hit the cold linoleum. "This man is a criminal. He's hacking our lives. Call the police. Do something." For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights. The patrons, men in grease-stained work shirts and weary commuters with calloused hands, didn't move toward their phones. They didn't even look at the mother with pity. One regular, a grizzled man who had sat in the same stool for a decade, slowly turned his head. He looked at the mark on Cassie's apron, then at the girl in the purple dress, and finally at the parents who had sanctioned the cruelty. He didn't pull out a phone to help. Instead, he slowly folded his arms across his chest and looked back at his half-empty coffee. One by one, the other patrons followed suit. They leaned back into their booths or turned their stools away from the family, effectively erasing them from the room. The weight of silence wasn't just quiet. It was a collective, unspoken verdict. The father tried to stand, his legs shaking, looking for an ally among the working class he had ignored until he needed them. But as he met the gaze of the Iron Tiger's men, he saw only the reflection of his own insignificance. The power dynamic had flipped. In this sanctuary of the common man, the wealthy were the outsiders, and their screams for help were swallowed by a community that had finally chosen to see Cassie instead of them. Cassie felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen's heat. She stood taller, her braids cascading over her shoulders like armor. She wasn't an invisible servant anymore. She was the reason the room had gone cold for the predators. The father's phone didn't just chime, it screamed. The caller ID displayed his law firm's senior partner, and as he answered with trembling fingers, the partner's panicked voice leaked into the silent diner like toxic gas. "It's over, Harold. The SEC just walked in with a full warrant for the offshore accounts. The board met 5 minutes ago. You're out, effective immediately. They're calling it gross moral turpitude. Your name is being scrubbed from the building as we speak." The phone slipped from his sweat-slicked hand, clattering onto the linoleum. Beside him, the mother was staring at a fresh notification from a high-society gossip blog. A leaked video of Mia spitting on Cassie was already racking up millions of views, the headline screaming, "The true face of the elite, a lesson in cruelty." The place they had so carefully curated, the galas, the boards, the silent nods of power, was being scorched by an invisible fire. Kangdae-oh didn't blink. He leaned back slightly, his white button-up shirt tight against his muscular chest, the black Korean characters on his neck a dark mark of judgment against the diner's warm, yellowed walls. He watched as the mother slumped into the red vinyl booth, her designer purse falling open to reveal a life she could no longer afford. She looked at Mia, who was sobbing now, her small hands no longer clutched in defiance but in absolute terror. The 12 pairs of eyes at the counter remained fixed on the scene, a jury of working men who had seen enough. The diner was a sanctuary of the common, and in this space, the parents looked like ghosts of a dead empire. The father tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, hollow rattle. He looked at Cassie, searching for the servant he had mocked, only to find a woman who stood with the quiet, somber power of someone who had never needed a bank account to possess dignity. "You're not being robbed," Kangdae said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to settle into the very marrow of their bones. "You're being balanced. You wanted her to know her place? Now you know yours. It's right here, on the floor of a diner, begging for a mercy you never learned how to give." The father collapsed back into the seat, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a tattered costume from a play that had been canceled mid-act. Kangdae's gaze moved from the cowering child to the damp mark on Cassie's blue apron, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He signaled to one of his men, who returned a moment later not with a weapon, but with a yellow mop bucket and a rough, industrial rag. The heavy clatter of the bucket hitting the linoleum sounded like a gavel striking a bench. "You spoke of places," Kangdae said, his voice a low, lethal thrum that vibrated the half-empty coffee cups on the surrounding tables. He gestured to the floor where the remnants of the child's tantrum and the spilled coffee lay. "In this place, the work is honest. The hands here are clean, even when they are covered in grease. Yours, however, are filthy with pride." The mother looked at the gray, damp rag, then at her husband, searching for a shred of the legal power that had evaporated minutes ago. Finding none, she looked toward the 12 pairs of eyes at the counter. The patrons watched with an icy, expectant stillness. There was no sympathy in the room, only the weight of a collective, silent judgment. "Clean it," Kangdae commanded. With trembling hands, the woman whose name had been etched on the donor walls of the city's most prestigious galleries dropped to her knees. The expensive fabric of her designer trousers soaked up the cold, spilled soda as she reached for the rag. Every scrub against the floor was a rhythmic confession of her own insignificance. Behind her, Kangdae turned his intense gaze to the father, who was still clutching his useless phone. "And you, there are tables to be cleared. Since you no longer have a firm to manage, you can manage the scraps." The man who had just lost $1 million empire began to stack heavy, ceramic plates, his hands shaking so violently the porcelain rattled. He moved through the diner, the invisible servant, now a public spectacle of his own failure. He felt every pair of eyes on his back, a crushing pressure he had never felt when he was the one looking down. Cassie stood by the counter, her posture upright and somber. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched the people who had tried to break her spirit discover that knowing one's place had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with the dignity of the work. For the first time, The parents weren't looking down on anyone. They were looking up from the floor at a woman they could no longer afford to ignore. The parents were still on the floor, their hands red from the industrial cleaner and the weight of their own shame, when Kangdae-oh finally stepped away from the door. He didn't loom. He didn't need to. His presence filled the diner like a gathering storm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gold-embossed coin, placing it on the damp table the father had just cleared. The symbol of a roaring tiger was etched into the metal. The father looked up, his eyes bloodshot, recognition finally flickering in his gaze. He had heard of the Iron Tiger, of the Iron Tiger Syndicate, a name whispered in boardrooms when debts went unpaid or when powerful men vanished into the night. "You're him," the father whispered, the realization draining the last of his breath. "The one they call the Tiger." Kangdae's jaw set, his eyes focused and unreadable, his slick-back pompadour catching the yellow light. "You taught your child that there are people in this world who do not matter," he said, his voice a quiet, dangerous vibration. "But you forgot the most important rule of the jungle. The tiger does not choose who he protects based on their bank account. He protects based on respect." He looked at the mark on Cassie's blue apron, where the young girl had spat. When your daughter spat on her, she didn't just spit on a waitress. She spat on the pride of the tiger. "And in my world, that is a debt that cannot be paid back in currency." He signaled to his men, who moved with a silent, synchronized command. The digital ruin was just the beginning. Kangdae continued, his tone devoid of mercy. "From this moment, you are prohibited from entering any business, any bank, or any social circle that carries my mark. You will live as the invisible people you mocked. You will work as she works, but without her honor." He turned his back on them, a silent command for the family to be removed. As the black SUVs outside hummed to life, Kangdae looked at Cassie one last time, her braids cascading over her shoulders as she stood with a dignified and somber posture. The iron verdict was delivered. The predators were gone, leaving only the wreckage of their ego on the diner floor. The heavy hum of the black SUVs faded into the city's roar, leaving the diner in a state of stunned, crystalline silence. The 12 pairs of eyes at the counter were no longer watching a tragedy. They were witnesses to a transformation. Kangdae-oh turned away from the door, the crisp white of his long-sleeved button-up shirt glowing under the fluorescent lights and the dark ink of the Korean characters on his neck visible as he approached the counter where Cassie stood. He reached into his pocket and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the laminate surface with a single, deliberate motion. Cassie didn't reach for it immediately. She looked at the man, the Iron Tiger, seeing the intense, focused expression of controlled resolve in his eyes, then back at the damp mark on her blue apron where the young girl had spit. Inside the envelope was a notarized deed, signed and stamped with the sudden, lethal efficiency of a man who commanded fear with a glance. The Iron Tiger Syndicate had not just ruined the girl's family. They had purchased the entire establishment and the ground it sat on, ensuring Cassie was gifted the deed to the diner. "They told you to know your place," Kangdae said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to settle into the very marrow of the room. "This is your place now. You are no longer a servant to the entitled. You are the owner of the ground you stand on." For the first time in 12 years, the weight Cassie Reed had carried, the debt, the exhaustion, and the role of the invisible servant, evaporated. She stood with a dignified and somber posture, her long braids cascading over her shoulders as she looked down at the document that redefined her existence. She didn't need to speak. The look of quiet strength in her eyes was enough. As Kangdae turned to leave, his powerful and controlled presence still lingering in the air, he nodded once to the regulars at the counter, a silent command that they were to respect their new boss. Cassie slowly untied the blue apron, no longer a uniform of servitude, but a relic of a dignity that had finally been vindicated. The city had changed, but the neon sign for the diner, now officially renamed Cassie's, glowed with a steady, reliable warmth. Inside, the invisible servant was long gone, replaced by a woman who managed her business with a dignified and somber posture that commanded the room. A young woman pushed through the double-glass doors, her movements quiet and deliberate. She wore a simple plaid shirt, her hair pulled back, far from the lace and arrogance of the purple dress she had worn a decade ago. Mia didn't ask for the best seat or complain about the wait. She waited her turn, ordered a black coffee, and left a generous tip before she even took a sip. She caught Cassie's eye across the counter, and a brief moment of silent recognition passed between them. It wasn't a look of shame, but one of profound, hard-earned gratitude. Mia knew that the day her family had lost everything was the day she had actually found her soul, stripped of the entitled poison her guardians had fed her. As Mia stepped out into the humid evening air, she felt a familiar weight in the atmosphere, a pressure that signaled a powerful and controlled presence nearby. Across the street, partially obscured by the amber glow of a street lamp and the cool blue shadows of a narrow alley, stood a black SUV. Leaning against the frame was a man whose silhouette remained unchanged by time. His slicked-back pompadour was a dark crown against the city lights, and even from a distance, the sharp line of his white shirt and the dark ink of the Korean characters crawling up his neck were unmistakable. Kangdae-oh didn't move. He didn't wave. He simply watched, his intense, focused gaze of controlled resolve ensuring the peace he had bought years ago remained unbroken. Mia stopped on the sidewalk. She didn't run, and she didn't look away. Instead, she tucked her hands at her sides and performed a deep, formal bow, a silent testament to the man who had forced her to learn the true meaning of place. The Iron Tiger watched the girl he had once broken and rebuilt, his expression unreadable. He had been her predator once, but in the shadow of the pompadour, he had become her silent guardian forever.